Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm pleased to have the opportunity to join this afternoon's discussion on this important but underreported crisis. Cameroon, which is one of the largest economies in Africa, is currently facing worsening violence and conflict. Today, 4.3 million people need humanitarian assistance across the country. That is 30% more than last year, and it means that one Cameroonian in 6 needs humanitarian assistance or protection. And most of those people needing help, more than half of them are children. 8 regions out of the country's 10 regions are affected by one of 3 concurrent, simultaneous humanitarian crises in Cameroon at the moment. Firstly, in its east and north regions, Cameroon is hosting more than 270,000 refugees from the Central African Republic, putting a significant burden on host communities who are already very poor and live in very fragile and vulnerable conditions. Second, Cameroon's far north remains affected by the Lake Chad Basin crisis. That, as you know, is one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. 1.9 million people or so living in Cameroon's far north, that's half the population of that part of the country, need urgent assistance, and that includes 100,000 refugees or more from Nigeria. I do, on this note, want particularly to thank and recognise the government of Cameroon and the people of Cameroon, especially in that part of the country, for their generosity in hosting refugees from neighbouring countries. Thirdly, the humanitarian situation in the northwest and southwest regions has rapidly deteriorated, and that is what I want to talk most about in my presentation to you today. The crisis in the northwest and southwest regions started with peaceful protests in the English-speaking regions, but has now turned violent. It was one of the fastest growing displacement crises in Africa last year. For the past 3 years, the population has been subjected to ongoing violence and attacks by armed actors. The level of the crisis today is more alarming than ever. Both the humanitarian and the security situation continue to deteriorate and run the risk of spiralling out of control, including in neighbouring departments, namely the littoral and west. In 2018, last year, 160,000 people were estimated to need humanitarian assistance in the northwest and southwest regions. Today, there are not 160,000, but more than 1.3 million people, at least 8 times as many, in need, and that amounts to a third of the local population. 500,000 people are internally displaced. Some of those internally displaced people stay with host communities in the main towns in the western part of the country, or in Yaoundé, or in the country's largest city, Douala. Most of them, though, are still hiding in the forests in fear of violence. Thousands of homes and entire villages have been destroyed across the 2 regions, and that poses significant challenges to the goal of return for people who fled. The fear of attacks further prevents people from being able to return, and also prevents access to previous livelihoods, especially farming and other livelihood opportunities in their home areas. That means those people are essentially increasingly, and in some cases totally, reliant on humanitarian assistance. Ordinary people are the direct targets of violence. Children are caught in crossfire. They're subject to arbitrary arrest and detention. The northwest and southwest regions used previously to be the places where education was best across the country, but a ban on education imported by armed actors has undermined that. In the past 3 years, at least 70 schools have been destroyed, pupils have been kidnapped, teachers have been kidnapped. Today, more than 80% of schools are closed. and more than 600,000 children are deprived of an education in both regions. Attacks on medical staff and infrastructure have also increased. There have been at least 70 such incidents noted since last year. They include the abductions of medical staff. They also include the burning of at least 3 hospitals. In both regions, some 40% of health facilities are simply not operational. Sexual violence and abuse are also increasingly documented. There are reports of girls as young as 13 living in the forest, pregnant and scared to move. In response to this grim reality, and despite the challenges, UN agencies and NGOs have scaled up the delivery of humanitarian assistance and protection. There are more than 40 humanitarian organisations operational today. They're mostly local NGOs. They've between them reached more than 100,000 people so far this year. 42,000 of the most vulnerable people received emergency livelihood programme or dry food delivery in March, but only 30,000 were reached with that kind of assistance in April. And that is a reflection of the access challenges and the impact of the continuing violence. While the environment is complex, there's no question that we need a more ambitious and comprehensive response. We're trying to target 820,000 people for assistance in the region this year. Insecurity, violence, what are called weekly ghost town days, where businesses and shops are closed and civilians are forced to stay at home, and frequent lockdowns, all of those things limit the days on which humanitarian operations are possible. We do have access. It's limited and unpredictable, and we continue to work with all actors to continue to improve it. We're also increasing our engagement with communities to build acceptance and negotiate access with all the parties. And on this point, we work through existing structures, including faith-based groups and national NGOs, who are often best placed to support access for the humanitarian agencies. Humanitarians themselves are at risk. At least a dozen national staff of humanitarian organisations have been abducted since last year. Thankfully, so far they've all been released. National NGOs are especially vulnerable to these risks, and we need more experienced humanitarian staff in order us to navigate these difficulties and complexities more effectively. The biggest challenge, notwithstanding everything I've said so far, relates to the insufficiency of funding. In 2018, the UN's Cameroon Humanitarian Response Plan was actually one of the smallest in terms of the resources we were seeking to respond to needs. Despite that, despite being a small plan, it was also one of the least well-funded globally. This year, the United Nations and NGOs are looking for some $300 million to reach 2.3 million people, including a third of them in the northwest and southwest regions. And of that $300 million, we've so far received only 38 million, less than 13% of what we require. Half of that money was received for the northwest and southwest crises, and most of that $19 million was in fact allocated by me through the Central Emergency Response Fund. I do want to thank all of the donors who provided funds to the SURF last year. As you know, we had a record-breaking year of financing for the SURF, and it was only because of that that we were able to make this allocation for those parts of Cameroon. There are 4 critical sectors: education, health, water and sanitation and hygiene, and nutrition, for which we've received barely any funding this year. Such is the overall situation on lack of funding. As you'll all understand, humanitarian organisations can't sustain a response unless they're funded. They're essentially out of their own forms of resources. Indeed, several key frontline humanitarian agencies, especially international NGOs, are going to be forced to withdraw from the region if additional funding doesn't reach them soon. It's in no one's interest, I think, to see the humanitarian situation spiral out of control. So I ask today for the help of the international community in 3 areas. First and foremost, to increase awareness of the humanitarian problem in Cameroon, and this afternoon's meeting is an important way of doing that, but we need to build on it. We have to persuade everybody to come together to address the underlying causes of the current crisis, including and especially the need for peaceful resolution of conflict and the need for more progress with sustainable development. Secondly, I ask for your support and that of others to improve the financing we have for the humanitarian operation so that we can reach a larger proportion of those people in need. And thirdly, I ask for your help and assistance in persuading and causing all parties to respect international law and to provide safe, timely and unimpeded humanitarian access. Anybody with influence over the parties should please exercise that influence. And we'll also need to urgently strengthen awareness and respect for humanitarian principles, including the protection of education and medical facilities. I've described to you the attacks on those facilities, which, as you know, those attacks are violations, and we need better compliance with the key elements of international law. This situation is quite urgent, and I therefore rely on your support to enable us to tackle it better. Thank you very much.